Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to this, the second Treasurer's Lecture. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Master Sarah Mullally. 2018 and 2019 were very important years for her. On the 12th of May of 2018, she was installed as the 133rd Bishop of London at St. Paul's Cathedral. She is the first female Bishop of London. She sits in the House of Lords as one of the Lords Spiritual, having been introduced on the 24th of May of 2018. On the 14th of March of 2018, she was sworn in as a Privy Councillor, and she became Dean of Her Majesty's Royal Chapels on the 11th of July, 2019. Shortly afterwards, in fact, 5 days later, she was elected as an honorary bencher of our Inn. Now, Bishop Sarah has had an interesting career. She is a late ordinand who before ordination was the Chief Nursing Officer in the Department of Health. In 2005, she was made a Dame Commander of the British Empire for her contribution to nursing and midwifery. She has continued her interest in the health service, having been a non-executive director at the Royal Marsden NHS Foundation Trust, and then at Salisbury NHS Foundation Hospital. She is now a member of council at King's College, London University. She is a novice potter, and now she is a patron of a charity which I chair called Paintings in Hospitals, an arts and wellbeing charity which, amongst other things, puts works of art into hospitals and hospices. Now tonight, on International Women's Day, the title of her lecture is Difference, Inclusion and Belonging on International Women's Day. There will be a chance for questions at the end of her lecture, and I would invite you, please, to use the email address that appears in the chat box at the foot of your Zoom page. Alternatively, you can send a private message to Oliver Munsey, who's under the name Middle Temple in your chat function, and I will deal with the questions at the end of this session. So without further ado, Master Mullally, welcome.
Treasurer, thank you very much for your welcome. It's a delight to be with you. My only regret is that we're not meeting in person. I've never thought of myself as a pioneer, but I was the youngest woman to be appointed as the government's Chief Nursing Officer for England, the fourth woman to be ordained Bishop in the Church of England, and as you've already heard, the first Bishop of London to be a woman. I see myself as ordinary, and in doing so, I recognise that I leave some baggage for my daughter. It has not passed me by that I was installed as the Bishop of London in the year when we marked 100 years after some women were given the vote, and in the week when 105 years before, suffragettes placed a bomb under the seat in which I was enthroned. The vergers at St. Paul's, just as eagle-eyed then as they are now, meant the bomb didn't go off. I'm not naturally subversive, but I am aware that as the first woman to be the Bishop of London, I am subversive by just being a woman, and it is a necessity that I have sought to embrace. Today I'm speaking to you on International Women's Day, the theme of which this year is Choose to Challenge. It therefore seems appropriate to reflect on my experience as well as offering some wider challenge, and in doing so, what I say contains challenges for my own work and my own ministry. I joined you in 2019 to mark the 100th year anniversary of a woman being admitted to an Inn of Court, which of course was the Middle Temple. And in 2022, it's the 100th anniversary of women being called to the bar. In respect of history, you are rather ahead of the Church on gender equality. In the Church of England, we have had female priests only since 1994. In 2015, the Right Reverend Libby Lane was consecrated and installed as the Bishop of Stockport, an assistant bishop in the Diocese of Chester, becoming our first female bishop. So 2019 marked 25 years since the first women were ordained priest. In early 2020, the campaign organisation Watch Women and the Church reported that although numbers were slowly increasing, some dioceses, having reached what is arguably a tipping point, with around 1/3 of their paid or stipendiary clergy being women. Others, including London, the diocese of which I am bishop, for multiple interrelated reasons, were still hovering around 15 to 20%. Of course, for those who did not want this change to come, it all feels as though the Church, after centuries with only male priesthood, has moved on a lightning speed. Many of those people feel deeply destabilised by the change. The Church of England's commitment to being a broad church led to a conscious decision to continue to offer a place of welcome and flourishing for those who dissent from the majority decision. Some would argue that the commitment to mutual flourishing of those with radically different perspectives on the issue is slowing a process of assimilation for female clergy. As the Church continues to be committed to that approach, we do need to ensure that flourishing is truly mutual. The ministries of women must be able to thrive, as well as those who find themselves profoundly at odds with the decision that the Church has taken. But I would want to say that there are other reasons for the sometimes painfully slow progress of change for women in the Church of England. And as we learn to articulate those reasons, we begin to make connections both within and beyond the Church with numerous underrepresented groups, not just women. If I ask myself, what have I learned as a woman within the NHS and the Church of England, and how that connects with other underrepresented groups, what might I say? Some might take the view that feminism has achieved its agenda, at least in the developed world. Gender equality, after all, is enshrined in key legislation in numerous ways, but we must recognise that globally it isn't quite as obvious. In 2017, the gender strategy of the NGO Christian Aid cited that in many societies, even before birth, a boy child is valued more than a girl child. The World Bank estimates that gender selective infanticide accounts for 1.56 million missing girls. At schools, girls' completion of primary and secondary education is still far below that of boys, and it is estimated that only 42% of girls with a disability complete primary education in the developing world. Even when women do complete schooling, they are still likely to be paid less than men, hold jobs more insecure than those of men, and are far less likely to hold managerial positions. 1 in 3 girls will be affected by domestic abuse, most likely from an intimate partner. I could go on, but I think that we can all agree that International Women's Day is not yet an obsolete occasion, at least for our sisters in other parts of the globe. We must continue to choose to challenge. It is, of course, the injustices, the lack of representation, prejudice and disadvantage experienced by an individual, which are often the result of what we now call intersectionality, the overlapping discriminations or disadvantages in life of one individual person. And that brings me back to the context here in the UK, to the issue of whether the feminist agenda here really has been achieved. And on this International Women's Day, it begs the question, which women are we talking about? The author and journalist Ruby Hamad has written an incisive critique of the roots and development of the feminist agenda. it is deeply challenging to white women, not least because she argues that white feminism has never had the interest of brown and black women at its heart or even in view. In White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Betrays Women of Colour, she argues that the colonialists projected dependent on white women supporting the project of subjugation of natives people. This puts them in a relatively privileged second place in a hierarchy which has white men on top, then white women, then brown and black men, followed at the bottom of the ladder by brown and black women. Tracing her argument through the lens of slavery, domestic servitude and sexual exploitation, she says, rather than consider respecting the bodies of brown and black women, white men and their female accomplices remove them from the concept of womanhood and humanity altogether. Hamad goes on to say that we can see the legacy of that behaviour in present day, in the habits and the perspectives which are solidified into something which she calls a strategic white womanhood. She tells us that as she reached this theory and the histories which it evidenced, that more and more I was wondering whether most, if not all white feminists who prioritize the concerns of white middle-class women as though they are representative of all women, are even listening to women of colour when we say we experience race and gender simultaneously rather than as distinct and separate impositions. So I turn back to the two institutions within which I have spent my working life. On the NHS Confederation website, I read, around 1 million women work for the NHS in England, making it one of the largest employers of women in the world. However, despite making up the majority of the NHS workforce, women are more likely than men to face structural constraints within this workplace, are paid less, are less likely to get promoted, and less likely to be represented in senior roles within the NHS. I then read a report by the King's Fund in July 2020 on workforce race inequalities and inclusion in the NHS providers, which tells me that despite having one of the most ethnically diverse workforces in the public sector, there are long-standing race inequality issues within the NHS workforce, including a lack of minority representation at senior levels, ethnic minority staff being much more likely to report that they have experienced discrimination at work than white staff, and fewer ethnic minority staff reporting their trust offers equal opportunities for career progression. I turn to the Church of England and I see that out of the 117 bishops currently in post, there are now 25 women, but only 2 women who are people of colour. Of course, I also notice when looking down the list of bishops that only 3 of the male bishops are people of colour. But the point I'm making, both about the NHS and the Church of England, taking Rudy Hamad's lead, is that women experience the negative impacts of their race and gender simultaneously. I do believe, however, that we are at a tipping point, perhaps not only in relation to race and gender, but also our understanding and appreciation of other diversities, and that gives me hope. The most obvious shift in the past 12 months has been in relation to our awareness of racial justice. When I say our awareness, of course I mean those of us who have white privilege, in the past blinded us to the depth and breadth of insidious and epidemic racial injustice. This has not been a luxury afforded to those who live it as a day-to-day reality. People of colour tell me that their predominant experience of multi-ethnic Britain in the past has been a society divided into cultural silos, existing alongside one another rather than living together in community. Living in silos makes it much more difficult to understand one another. It encourages a tendency to generalise, to stereotype, and to make assumptions about the other people with whom we mistakenly assume to be from the same background as one another. out of laziness and ignorance, we fail really to know our neighbour, though we might assume we do, to build trust, to share concerns, to learn to understand and appreciate the richness of one another's differences, and to be changed by one another's perspective takes work. And we haven't always wanted to do the hard work. So the reality of a multicultural UK is that we have not been, not in the best sense, multicultural. But in the past 12 months, the coronavirus pandemic has shone a glaring light onto this. Specifically, it has revealed that people of colour have been disproportionately affected by the virus. This has led to questions about why this is the case. A study by University London suggests that COVID-19 has replicated existing health inequalities and in some cases increased them. Social disadvantage is a major influencing factor because people of colour are more likely to live in urban and deprived areas and overcrowded households, have less income protection and jobs that expose them to higher risk of contracting the virus. In June last year, one of my colleagues, Jason Roach, wrote an article which began with the words, "Recent reports around ethnicity and COVID-19 have surprised me. They have explained that Black people are 4 times more likely to die of coronavirus than white people, and we don't know all the reasons why." But it wasn't this fact that astonished me. The real shock was that this was actually a surprise to anyone. Health inequalities between ethnic groups is old news. Last year, I asked a question in the Lords based on the statistic which tells us that in the UK, Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. The figure in the US is 3 times. There are issues around the lack of UK ME midwives and senior staff in the midwifery sector, stereotyping and pregnant women not being listened to, a need for empowerment and confidence to ask questions, lack of awareness of rights, inconsistency of allocation of finances, inadequate tele-translation service, and lack of cultural competency within the service. And this is just one area of healthcare under the experience of UK ME women in Britain. Then into the context where the pandemic was turning up the volume on messages around health and social inequalities for UK ME people came the death of George Floyd, which amplified the issues which the Black Lives Matter movement, and before it many other movements of rights back to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, have been highlighting for decades. Given the numerous reports and inquiries into racial injustice in this country, perhaps particularly the Macpherson report in 1999, it is astonishing that it took the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis to bring racial inequality to the forefront of our consciousness in this country. The Black Lives Matter movement itself was founded back in 2013 by 3 Black female organisers in the US, and George Floyd's death gave momentum to conversations, protests, journalism, workplaces initiatives, and a breadth of activity around racial justice, which we have not known in the UK before. If we are truly going to live out by our belief in the equality of all people from all backgrounds, with all their gifts and differences, lived experiences, disabilities, disadvantage and privilege, a significant cultural shift must happen. It must be embedded at the deepest levels and must be consistently lived out. In respect to equality, diversity and inclusion, this is the sort of societal shift seems to involve several stages. There's a stage where the language of equal opportunity and accommodation of particular needs kicks in, perhaps best illustrated in the societal responses to disability. People living with disabilities have taught us in recent years that disadvantage and disability are not necessarily inherent, but are frequently societally imposed. If it is not possible for an individual to fulfill their potential, to participate fully in all aspects of society, to offer their gifts and be seen, heard and known as equals, this is often attributable to the lack of simple accommodation on the part of the wider society. Furthermore, these basic accommodations are not made the rest of society impoverished, as the gifts of disabled people are not seen, heard, recognised or received. In the context of the church, the strapline of the movement Disability in Jesus puts it this way very powerfully. A church without disabled people is a disabled church. That is a truth that applies beyond the church. In relation to gender, I've seen similar shifts in understanding reflected in the family-friendly policies of the Church of England. We have developed over recent decades from being non-existent to being limited to describing statutory rights and responsibilities around maternity leave, to embracing adoption leave and parental leave, and only last year a step change, a toolkit of resources relating to family-friendly policies set in the context and bearing the message. Those called to public ministry are also called to other vocations. These enrich ordained ministry. In those few words lie the acknowledgement that the diversity of human existence we have and live through are potentially gifts to the context in which we work, and of course shape our contribution to society and our neighbours. Our difference are not negatives to be overcome, but carry with them the seed of profoundly different human learning. In very recent times, the neurodiversity movement has been teaching us this by challenging the notion that those with an autism diagnosis should adapt their responses to the way they experience the world in order to fit in with the behaviours and the expectations of neurotypicals. The American author Sparrow Rose Jones, herself autistic, writes, "Autistic's acceptance means working to understand why we do things and carefully discerning before you try to change our behaviour. Do you not want to change it to help us to be healthier and happier? Do you want to change it because you think other people will not accept the way we are?" The phase "we are all on the spectrum," whilst not entirely helpful if it distracts from the necessary accommodations which people with a diagnosis of autism articulates as being necessary for themselves, does at least point us away from the language of othering. Othering is our habit of seeing difference as division, of putting people who are different from themselves in separate categories over there, distance, and somehow less valued. Again, Sparrow Rose Jones has a powerful message which challenges this habit. Know that we belong here. Know that we are not among you. We are you. I have learnt much about the language of othering and its potential damage to distort our relationship and societal interactions in my conversations through the pandemic with a particular group of clergy. These are people who've had to shield throughout the pandemic because either they or somebody with whom they live are clinically extremely vulnerable. They have told me of their horror at times when they have perceived an underlying narrative in the national discourse about the management of the pandemic. A narrative which has arguably implied that some lives are more dispensable than others. They have also spoken eloquently about their sense of being left behind or forgotten, both by the institutional church and wider society, as the measures put in place for the emergence from each lockdown have not taken or addressed their continued vulnerability. On a different front, the Church of England is currently encouraging and resourcing conversations across all of its dioceses called Living in Love and Faith, focused on Christian teaching and learning about identity, sexuality, relationships and marriage. Even if you know nothing at all about the Church of England, you can probably guess that this is causing a little controversy. The resource material includes short videos exploring the lived experience of Christians who, for example, are gay, straight, transgender, intersex, married to somebody who has subsequently transitioned, and same-sex attracted while celibate. Sharing their stories in this context has taken considerable courage and represents a significant degree of risk for people. Those within the church who hold to what might be described as traditional or orthodox views on these matters tell me that they too feel that engaging in these discussions is risky, as they fear being labelled homophobic or transphobic simply for articulating their theology. I'm telling you this because it is deeply illustrative of how difficult we find it is as human beings to address issues of difference and diversity with courage, without feeling for our psychological and, in some cases, physical safety. Hate crime is a reality. Abuse expressed itself in violence against women, people of colour, and those who are LGBTQAI+, both physically and in an online world, which is so easily weaponised for this purpose, is unacceptable. The Church of England's Living in Love and Faith project offers 6 pastoral principles as people prepare to engage on issues which are deeply divisive, reminding us to acknowledge prejudice, speak into silence, address ignorance, cast out fear, admit hypocrisy, and pay attention to power. These are useful tools in the context of this particular project, but they are also life lessons which, if we learn them well, could transform our social and political discourse on so many things, including, of course, equality and diversity and inclusion. As the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, Bishop of Dover, has said of our continued engagement around the Brexit issues, modelling a process of good listening to one another, and especially with those holding a different perspective, is where the Church could have made and can still make the biggest difference. That good listening, of course, requires everybody to be at the table. One of our Black ordinands, Augustus Tanner Him, said in the sermon which won him a theology slam competition last year, accessibility is being able to get into the building. Diversity is being invited to the table. Inclusion is having a voice at the table. Belonging is having a voice heard at the table. I am aware that I haven't made explicit the connection in what I have said with the faith and theology which underpins my life as a Christian, as a priest, and as a bishop in the Church of England. I would simply say that I hold to the foundational Genesis truth that we are all made in God's image and reflect that image in the world, and that we must recognise that until every human bit belongs at the table and is heard, the picture of God that the Church reflects is incomplete, marred, impoverished, and skewed. As will society here in the UK and beyond. Or to borrow the metaphor from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, we are one body with many parts, and no part whatever should be considered lesser than the other part. Neither have I made the connections which I believe you're more than capable of making for yourselves regarding the part which you can play and I can play in ensuring accessibility, diversity, inclusion and belonging for all within your profession. As those who uphold justice and who shape the legal profession in all of its breadth, complexity and power to influence society, you have considerable opportunity to do this. I do believe that those of us who have a platform from which to speak and with positions of societal responsibility must use the privilege to open the door to other individuals and to groups who are currently at best underrepresented and at worst grossly disadvantaged. We must be gate openers, not gatekeepers. And however hard that might feel to someone who might feel that for themselves this privilege has been hard won. And of course, it isn't just about opening gates. It's about working to change the structures which have kept and still keep those gates firmly closed to so many people. We can also use our position to amplify the voices, something which I have encouraged female clergy with whom I work to do for one another. They are in a majority, and there are undoubtable times when they find it difficult to make their voices heard. Of course, they should not hold back on what they have to say themselves, but they can, perhaps particularly through social media, amplify the good things which their female colleagues are doing and saying, and the gifts which they are to the church. I've also tried to use opportunities which my role affords to offer a platform to women of colour, lay and ordained, as they speak of their experiences of racism and their striving for racial justice in our church and beyond. In all of this, I am conscious of the pitfalls of falling into the mould of a white saviour, or the equivalent in relation to different disadvantaged groups. I am not a white saviour, nor, I hope, do I indulge in virtue signalling. I am painfully aware in the conversations about diversity of all kinds that I get things wrong, use words that I don't realise are offensive, fail to ensure that everyone who ought to be in the room is in the room, that every decision made and communicated drafted has the right eyes on it before it is sent. But I urge myself and the church in the direction of courage and not cowardice in engaging in these profoundly significant issues and recognising what Christians call as a kairos moment, a moment of profound significance and opportunity, a tipping point. Those of you who have read or heard of Bernie Brown on the subject of daring gently will know that she quotes Theodore Roosevelt when talking about courageous leadership. Roosevelt said, of course, that the credit belongs not to those who criticise from the sidelines, but to those in the arena, striving to do the deeds, who fall short again and again, because there is no effort without error or shortcoming. These people, Roosevelt says, if I fail, at least I fail by daring greatly. In our debates and conversations and best efforts to understand one another in all our glorious difference, we will get it wrong sometimes, probably often. And surely what matters is that we are in the arena, doing all that we can to make a difference. Thank you.
Master Mullally, thank you for such an informative, enlightening, and thought-provoking lecture. It highlights the need for so much more work to be done before gender and race equality is achieved. I'm very grateful to you for having found time, particularly today in your busy diary, to come and talk to us, because I'm conscious that today is not only International Women's Day, but it's also Commonwealth Day. And I know that you've had a lot to do already. So thank you very much indeed. Now, as I anticipated, there are a few questions that have been raised following your speech, and I wonder if I could put them to you. The first is this: I love the 6 principles that you set out for transforming our discourse. In a community like the bar and the inn, naturally adversarial, and dare I say, argumentative, how do you think that we can improve our listening skills?
I think the first step is to realise that we have to improve our listening skills. I think that's probably the first step. So in realising that, I think that is important. I think the pastoral principles that the Church of England has developed are only as good as people use them and accept them, and also realise that it takes work to do it. And so I think that I would encourage you, having recognised that maybe you need to develop your ability to listen, is to look at how you can, amongst yourselves, develop principles for that behaviour, and then to practice them. I was very grateful recently to watch two of my colleagues use the pastoral principles in a conversation that they had. It was a part of a wider, one of our synodical meetings. And actually, by watching people use the guidelines, you begin to understand how you could learn them yourself. So I would encourage you, first of all, if you've recognized you need to listen, that's great. Together work principles, but then practice them. And whilst it may just sound a bit, contrived, actually it does work. If you think much more carefully about what you're saying, you're better able to shape it. And if you practice them, then you're better able to do it when that heated moment arises.
The next question relates to both what you've done in the past and what you do now. Which of your two professions did you find taught you the most lessons in terms of diversity and inclusion?
Gosh. I often say that, rather than having two professions, I've had one vocation, and that's to follow Jesus Christ. And therefore, and there are great similarities about nursing and about being a priest, not least that it involves people. And as we've already talked, it involves listening and being with. And I think that, so I do think, and I have experienced diversity in both those two environments. And I think one of the things that I realize is that I have to continue to relearn the lessons. And in each new situation, I relearn the lessons of differing diversity. And it is a challenge for me to remember to have, that question about having the right people in the room, to have the right people who are looking over drafting, the right people who involved in conversations is really important. And I guess when I was in the NHS, we did quite a change at the time around beginning to listen and to learn from the patient's view. And that was quite a hard cultural change. And some of you may feel the NHS hasn't learned that, but I think it has learned a lot from understanding to see things through the eyes of people. We also did a lot of work around, we called it work around breaking the glass ceiling from those from UK minorities. But I was reminded very recently, re-looking at the figures, that actually the NHS are probably no better off in terms of those from UK minorities in leadership positions. So it's that learning again. And then I come into the church, and the diversity within the church, within our communities, is so much wider, again, from the NHS. And so for me, it's the question of saying, who is it that you're serving? Who is in our community and who is not at the table? And how do we change that? So I think that I've learned through both really, and maybe some of the lessons that I've learned the best have been the most painful. And that's where I go back to saying that daring to change sometimes brings with it a cost. And that is sometimes from learning the lessons as much as from having the courage to step forward.
Well, if I can pick up on some words that you used at the end of that answer, daring to change, you cited some pretty bad statistics in terms of people of colour and women holding senior positions in the church. The question that's been posed is this: you cited the relative low numbers of women and minority groups as bishops in the Church of England. What is it, in your view, that is preventing the church from addressing this problem?
Gosh, where do you start? Where do you start? I think first of all, you have to recognise the history on which the Church of England is built. You have to recognise the years of racial injustice and discrimination for which, I'm profoundly sorry. And I think you have to recognise that if we want to change those figures, the church itself has to change. And that means, and I often recognise that in terms of enabling, I do a lot of mentoring, a lot of coaching of people coming forward for ministry in the Church of England from the global majority. And I increasingly recognise I have to be careful not to coach them to be a white woman. You know, that what the church has to do is to change, to enable them to fulfill their vocation with all their diversity that they bring. And I think one of our biggest challenges, as you will have indicated, is that the church often doesn't want to change. And I think that maybe is our biggest challenge. And by that, I don't mean, you know, I mean, I suppose the Church of England as a church, but also the local church. Because if we're truly to recognise the diversity of our communities in our church, the diversity of the body of Christ, the diversity of God, the church itself will have to change. And because the church, if led by the global majority, will look different than it does today. And certainly, and my belief is that we have to change, and I have a personal commitment to bring that about. But I don't underestimate the challenge.
Following on from that, the next question highlights the difference of opinion on these issues that exist within the church and the different factions that there are. And it's put in this way: thank you for such a comprehensive overview of what is a very broad field. You mentioned the need of the Anglican Church to integrate both the people who support the ordination of women and those who find it very hard to live with the concept of female priests. The dichotomy of views may be greater still once you take into account that Anglicanism straddles many cultures worldwide, including cultures that have a different view, for example, in relation to disabilities, same-sex love, and transgender issues. How do you see the church's role in resolving those?
Gosh, there's an easy question, isn't it?
I thought I'd leave the easy ones to last.
Okay. I think, it's interesting. I think that, so the Church of England is part of the wider Anglican Church. And I always feel that we, in a sense, we should look to our own first in terms of, the wider Anglican communion. So there's something about us addressing these issues first of all. And as I said, that we've got an opportunity to do disagreement well. As I indicated when I spoke, there are some that feel that that's allowing to flourish both women and those who cannot accept the ordination of women is holding women back. But that is the settled position of the Church of England. And I think there is something to learn from that, and it is an experience of my everyday life about how I support those people who do not accept my role as a bishop in the Diocese of London, and I know what that looks like, and you have to work very hard at it, but you can do disagreement with something that is so profound, and you can work together and reflect something that is loving. However, I will call out when I see something that is a discrimination against women. So I will call that out. And one of the challenging conversations I have to have is what is an orthodox theology and what is discrimination? And that is a tough question to have, but you have to have the environment in which to be able to have that conversation. And so I think there's something about how we do those conversations well. And I also think that the journey that we're on around living in love and faith, I mean, we've only just started that. But I think even in starting at that, my belief is that we're having to have conversations very explicitly about things that are very personal and about people's identity and being. And actually, there is something to learn about that. So I suppose my challenge is I take the wider challenge of the Anglican Church, and there are some very difficult situations there. And so, but I first of all say, let's look to our own and how we face these difficult conversations and have some of those challenging conversations about how we find a way forward.
Thank you. I have two more questions, I think, in the time that we have available. Audre Lorde's definition of tokenism was an empty gesture designed to placate and even silence our demands for more equitable treatment. How do we determine whether initiatives, particularly recent efforts, are genuine and not mere tokenism?
I think that's very tough. You know, in terms of in the Diocese of London, we have a group of people working on one of our priorities as we move forward with our vision and strategy, is that of racial justice. And so I have a group that is working on that priority, and it is a mixed group. Predominantly, it is Anglican. It is Anglican global majority, but within it there are some white Anglicans as well, and they're working on what does that look like. And interesting enough, it is a conversation that I've had with them around, for example, we in London, we have a number of bishops. None of us, well, I suppose I could say all of us, are white. Fortunately now 2 of us are women, but until 3 years ago none of us were women, and none of them were women, they were all men. And so the challenge is that I am committed to seeing that change, and for the appointment of a UK minority or an Anglican or a global majority person into one of those posts. And we have the debate, is that tokenism? Or do you need people, you know, do people need to see somebody that looks like them to believe it is possible? And I guess what they come back with is that it isn't tokenism as long as the other structural injustices are being tackled, as long as the other those other things that are on their list are being put in place. And therefore, I think that's the important thing, that it is part of a whole and not seen as one thing on its own. And maybe it's the easy thing. Well, I suspect it's not necessarily that easy if you look at the number of bishops who come from a global majority, but it may be easier than some of the other structural changes. So the truth is, it's about committing to the broader work that's required. And then my belief is not just tokenism, it's part of a greater whole. And in truth, I hope that group within this diocese will continue to challenge me on that.
And my final question is this, and it relates to the inn. What advice would you give to the young woman entering a career at the bar for self-fulfillment and career success?
Oh gosh, when I give them any more advice that I give them. Oh gosh, I think for me it's about, you know, it's about understanding who they are. You know, I talk about myself, you know, there's a wonderful passage in the book of Esther. Esther was chosen for her looks to marry the king, and one of her sort of attendant and her people were being killed. And so she has the opportunity to go to the king to stop him doing this, which is a very risky thing. And her attendant says to her, Esther, for such a time as this. And so, and my sense of that is to remember that we are, you know, we are who we are, and we will find ourselves in places for such a time as this, and we bring with us, you know, all that we are. So there's something about not being the person that we see over there, or, you know, or the person that is mentoring us, but to understand who we are. Now that takes a bit of journey to be who we are and to live with integrity to who we are. Now that takes a bit of a journey to do that, because the truth is I'm not the same as my colleague bishops. You know, I am very different. And so therefore the advice I would say is understand who you are with all the gifts and the talents that you have brought, and to have an integrity about who you are, and to know that maybe you're there just for such a time as this.
Well, Bishop Sarah, Master Mullally, this was such a time. And thank you so much for your inspirational lecture. If you've got time, have a look at the chat box, because it is full of the most complimentary messages, and they are well deserved. It has been a great evening and a privilege. Thank you very much indeed. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.